Sun cast long shadows across the academy's training grounds as Lieutenant Sarah, Phoenix, Martinez adjusted her flight suit one final time before entering the briefing room. At 26, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place through grit rather than connections. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her brown eyes held the steady focus that had carried her through 3 tours overseas before she'd been selected for the elite instructor position at the Air Force Academy. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as 24 fresh-faced cadets filed in, their pressed uniforms still bearing the crisp lines of new fabric. This was their first advanced flight training session, and Sarah could practically taste their mixture of excitement and terror. She'd been where they were once, hungry to prove herself, desperate to earn the respect of instructors who seemed impossibly experienced and unattainable. "Good morning, cadets," Sarah began, her voice cutting through the chatter with military precision. "I'm Lieutenant Martinez, and for the next 8 weeks I'll be responsible for determining whether you have what it takes to earn your wings." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room, nodding the way some cadets straightened their spines while others shifted uncomfortably. "Some of you will wash out. Statistics tell us that 30% of you won't make it through this phase of training. My job isn't to coddle you or make you feel better about yourselves. My job is to push you beyond what you think you're capable of, and if you break, better it happens here than at 30,000 feet with lives depending on you." In the third row, Cadet First Class Brandon Razor Thompson leaned back in his chair with a smirk that Sarah recognized immediately. She'd seen it countless times before, the look of someone who thought he already knew everything, who believed his natural talent would carry him through without the grinding work that true excellence demanded. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his posture relaxed in a way that bordered on insolent, and his blue eyes held the kind of cockiness that came from being told he was special his entire life. Thompson raised his hand without waiting to be acknowledged. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I've logged over 200 hours in civilian aircraft, including aerobatic training. I'm wondering if perhaps I might be better suited for the advanced track rather than starting with basic maneuvers." A few cadets turned to look at Thompson with expressions ranging from admiration to horror at his audacity. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with being challenged by someone who had no idea what they were talking about. She'd encountered dozens of Thompsons over the years, privileged kids who thought their daddy's money and a few hours in a Cessna made them hotshot pilots. 200 hours, Sarah repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "That's impressive, Cadet Thompson. Tell me how many of those hours were spent in combat conditions. How many times did you have to bring a damaged aircraft home while under enemy fire? How many times did you have to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between your wingman coming home to his family or arriving in a flag-draped coffin?" Thompson's smirk faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "Well, no combat experience yet, ma'am, but I've studied extensively, and my instructors at the civilian school said I was a natural. I just think that starting with basic maneuvers might be beneath my current skill level." The room had gone completely silent now, the other cadets sensing the shift in atmosphere like animals before a storm. Sarah took a slow step forward, her hands clasped behind her back in a pose that was deceptively casual. She'd learned long ago that the most dangerous moments often came wrapped in quiet confidence rather than obvious aggression. "Beneath your skill level," she repeated thoughtfully. "Cadet Thompson, would you mind sharing with the class what you think separates a good pilot from a great one?" Thompson straightened slightly, clearly pleased to have the spotlight. "Technical proficiency, ma'am, quick reflexes, good spatial awareness, the ability to think fast under pressure. Natural talent, really. Some people have it, others don't." Several cadets nodded in agreement, but Sarah noticed a few of the sharper ones frowning slightly, as if sensing that their classmate had just walked into a trap. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile a shark might wear before closing in on wounded prey. "Natural talent," Sarah mused. "That's an interesting perspective. Anyone else want to weigh in on what makes a great pilot?" She looked around the room, her gaze settling on a quiet cadet in the front row. "Cadet Williams." Williams, a small woman with earnest eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a working-class background, straightened nervously. "Ma'am, I think it's about more than just natural ability. It's about discipline, training, learning from mistakes, about trusting your team and being someone they can trust in return." "Excellent answer, Cadet Williams." Sarah's smile was genuine now as she turned back to Thompson. You see, Cadet Thompson, natural talent is just the starting point. It's like having a fast car but not knowing how to drive it properly. Technical proficiency can be taught, reflexes can be honed, but character, the kind of character that keeps you alive and brings your people home, that has to be forged through experience and humility. Thompson's face had begun to redden, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. With respect, ma'am, I think results speak for themselves. I've never failed a check ride, never had a safety violation. My record speaks for itself. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't anger exactly, but something colder and more focused. She recognized the look in Thompson's eyes. It was the same look she'd seen in the mirror years ago, back when she'd thought her own natural abilities made her invincible. Life had a way of teaching those lessons harshly, and she'd learned them in places where mistakes had permanent consequences. "Your record," Sarah said quietly, moving closer to Thompson's desk. "Tell me, Cadet, what exactly does your record say about your character, about your ability to lead others, about how you handle real adversity, not the sanitized version they create in civilian flight schools?" Thompson's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I don't think my character is in question here. I'm simply pointing out that I have more experience than most of my classmates, and I believe I could benefit from more challenging instruction." "More challenging instruction?" Sarah nodded thoughtfully, then moved to the front of the room where a computer terminal waited. "Very well, Cadet Thompson, you want to be challenged. Let's see what your record really says." Her fingers moved over the keyboard with practiced efficiency, pulling up the cadet database. "Everyone deserves to know what they're working with, don't you think?" The wall screen flickered to life, displaying Thompson's cadet record in crisp detail. Sarah's eyes scanned the information quickly, her expression remaining neutral even as she absorbed the details that painted a picture of privilege and expectation rather than earned achievement. Private flight training from age 16, paid for by a father who owned a chain of car dealerships. A spotless disciplinary record that spoke more to careful rule-following than true moral character. Academic scores that were good but not exceptional. Letters of recommendation from family, friends, and civilian instructors who had likely never seen real combat. But it was the section marked Family History that made Sarah pause. Her finger hovered over the trackpad for a moment before clicking, expanding the details that would explain so much about Thompson's attitude. The screen updated, showing a genealogy that included 3 generations of military service, including a grandfather who had been a decorated World War II bomber pilot and a father who had served briefly in the National Guard before transitioning to civilian life. "Interesting family history, Cadet Thompson," Sarah said, her voice still carefully controlled. "It looks like you come from a long line of service members. That's something to be proud of." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room before returning to Thompson. "Tell me, what do you think your grandfather would say about your approach to training, about your assumption that you deserve special treatment because of your civilian flight hours?" Thompson's confidence finally began to crack. "Ma'am, I don't think I was asking for special treatment. I was just—" "You were just what, Cadet?" Sarah's voice cut through his stammering with surgical precision. "You were just assuming that your 200 hours of weekend flying somehow qualified you to skip the fundamentals that every combat pilot must master. You were just deciding that the training program developed by combat veterans with thousands of hours of real-world experience wasn't good enough for someone of your obvious talent." The silence in the room was deafening now. Thompson's face had gone from red to pale, and Sarah could see the moment when his bravado finally crumbled entirely. She felt no satisfaction in it. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about teaching a lesson that could save lives later. "Let me tell you something about natural talent, Cadet Thompson," Sarah continued, her voice softer now but no less intense. "I knew a pilot once who had more natural ability in his little finger than most people have in their entire body. He could fly anything with wings, could perform maneuvers that defied physics, could land a damaged aircraft in conditions that would terrify most pilots. He was cocky, confident, absolutely certain of his own abilities. And you know what happened to him?" She paused, letting the question hang in the air. Every cadet in the room was leaning forward now, caught up in the story despite themselves. "He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60, Row 15, Grave 143. His name was Captain Jake Morrison, call sign Iceman, and he died because he thought his natural talent made him invincible. He thought the rules didn't apply to him, that his superior skills meant he could take risks that others couldn't. And maybe he was right. Maybe he could have pulled off the maneuver that killed him if he'd been flying alone. But he wasn't alone, Cadet Thompson. He was leading a formation, and when he went down, he took 2 other aircraft with him. 6 men died that day because one pilot thought he was too good for standard procedures. The room had gone completely still. Sarah could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of aircraft taking off from the nearby runway, the quiet breathing of 24 young people who were beginning to understand that the games they'd been playing were about to become deadly serious. "Now," Sarah said, returning to her position at the front of the room, "would you like to tell me again about how you think basic maneuvers are beneath your skill level?" Thompson's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The other cadets watched in fascination and horror as their classmate, who just moments before had seemed so confident and self-assured, struggled to find his voice. Sarah allowed the silence to stretch for several heartbeats before moving on, but she could see that the lesson had landed exactly where it needed to. "Right then," she said briskly, turning back to the computer terminal. "Let's move on to your flight assignments. You'll be working in pairs for the first phase of training, with experienced cadets mentoring newer ones." Her fingers moved across the keyboard as she began calling out names and partnerships, but Thompson's hand shot up again, this time with considerably less arrogance. "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize. You're absolutely right about the fundamentals, and I spoke out of turn." His voice was quieter now, more measured. "I'd like to request assignment to the most challenging program available if you think I can handle it." Sarah paused, studying Thompson's face carefully. She'd seen this transformation before, the moment when cocky young pilots realized they were playing in a different league entirely. Sometimes it stuck, and they became exceptional officers. Sometimes it was just a temporary setback before their arrogance reasserted itself. Time would tell which category Thompson fell into. "Interesting timing for that change of heart, Cadet," she said, her voice neutral. "But I appreciate the sentiment. As it happens, I do have a particularly challenging assignment in mind." She turned back to the computer, pulling up a new screen. "You'll be paired with Cadet Elena Vasquez for your initial training flights." A ripple of murmurs went through the room, and Sarah noticed several cadets exchanging glances that ranged from surprise to what looked almost like pity. Thompson frowned, clearly sensing that there was something he wasn't understanding about this assignment. "Ma'am, is there something I should know about Cadet Vasquez?" he asked cautiously. Before Sarah could answer, the briefing room door opened with a bang that made several cadets jump. A figure in a wheelchair rolled in with practiced efficiency, navigating between the desks with a kind of spatial awareness that spoke of long experience. The woman in the chair appeared to be in her early 20s, with short-cropped auburn hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture ramrod straight despite being seated, and there was something about the way she carried herself that commanded immediate respect. "Sorry I'm late, Lieutenant Martinez," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "Medical appointment ran over." She maneuvered her wheelchair to an empty space at the side of the room with fluid precision, then looked up at Sarah with an expression that was both apologetic and completely unashamed. "No problem, Cadet Vasquez," Sarah replied, and Thompson could have sworn he heard something like warmth in the instructor's voice for the first time that morning. "We were just discussing flight partnerships. You'll be working with Cadet Thompson." Elena's gaze shifted to Thompson, and he found himself under scrutiny that was somehow both friendly and absolutely merciless. She studied him for a moment, taking in his still-flushed face and uncertain posture, and Thompson had the uncomfortable feeling that she was reading him like an open book. "Ah," Elena said, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "The one with all the civilian flight hours, right? 200, wasn't it?" The way she said it made it clear that she'd heard at least part of his earlier exchange with Lieutenant Martinez, and Thompson felt his face heating up again. "Yes, ma'am." "I mean, yes," Thompson stammered, unsure of the proper protocol for addressing a fellow cadet who somehow commanded the kind of respect usually reserved for senior officers. "Excellent," Elena said, her smile widening. "I do love a challenge." Sarah cleared her throat, drawing attention back to the front of the room. "Before we continue with assignments, I think Cadet Thompson and the rest of you should understand exactly who you're working with." She turned back to the computer terminal, and Thompson noticed that several other cadets were leaning forward with expressions of anticipation, as if they knew something significant was about to be revealed. "Cadet Vasquez," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a formal tone, "would you mind sharing with the class how you came to be here at the academy?" Alina shrugged, the gesture somehow managing to be both casual and dignified. Standard path, really. Enlisted at 18, served 4 years before receiving my appointment here. Nothing too unusual about that. Nothing unusual, Sarah repeated, and now Thompson was certain he heard something like amusement in her voice. Would you mind being a bit more specific about your service record? Well, Alina said, and Thompson noticed that she seemed slightly uncomfortable with the attention. I was stationed at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan for most of my enlistment. Air traffic control, mostly. Some transport coordination. Air traffic control? Sarah nodded. At one of the busiest and most dangerous airfields in the theater of operations. How many combat landings would you say you coordinated, Cadet? Alina's cheeks colored slightly. I'm not sure of the exact number, ma'am. Several hundred, I suppose. Several hundred, Sarah repeated. And how many emergency situations did you handle? Medical evacuations, aircraft with battle damage, pilots coming in under fire. Ma'am, I really don't think. Humor me, Cadet. Alina sighed. Probably around 50 or 60 significant emergencies over my 4-year enlistment. But ma'am, that was my job. Nothing heroic about doing your job. Thompson felt something cold settling in his stomach as he began to understand just how thoroughly he'd misjudged the situation. Around him, other cadets were nodding with expressions of respect and even awe, and he realized that Alina Vasquez was something of a legend among the cadet corps. Nothing heroic, Sarah mused. I suppose that's one way to look at it. Of course, that assessment might not account for the Silver Star citation in your file. She paused, letting that information sink in. Would you mind telling Cadet Thompson what you received that Silver Star for? Alina's jaw tightened, and for the first time since entering the room, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. Ma'am, I'd really prefer not to discuss that. It's not relevant to flight training. I disagree, Cadet. I think it's very relevant. Sarah's voice was gentle but implacable. Especially given some of the attitudes we've encountered this morning about the value of real-world experience versus natural talent. The room had gone completely silent again, but this time the tension was different. Instead of the anticipatory discomfort that had accompanied Thompson's earlier humiliation, there was a sense of profound respect for whatever story was about to unfold. Alina was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on the wheels of her chair. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but Thompson could hear the weight of memory in it. There was a medical evacuation helicopter that took heavy fire on approach to the base, she said quietly. The pilot was wounded, the aircraft was severely damaged, and they were coming in way too fast with no radio contact. Standard procedure would have been to clear the runway and let them attempt an emergency landing, but... She paused, her jaw working as if she were tasting something bitter. But, Sarah prompted gently. But there were 2 F-18s already on final approach, low on fuel after a combat mission. If I'd cleared the runway for the helicopter, the fighters would have had to wave off, and they didn't have enough fuel for another approach. They would have had to eject over hostile territory. Alina's voice was matter-of-fact, but Thompson could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her knuckles had gone white where she gripped her wheelchair. So what did you do? Sarah asked, though Thompson suspected she already knew the answer. I coordinated a triple simultaneous landing, Alina said simply. Helicopter on the grass beside the runway, both fighters on the runway itself with about 50 meters separation. The helicopter crew made it, the fighter pilots made it, everyone went home to their families. Thompson found himself holding his breath, waiting for the rest of the story, sensing that there was more to come. That doesn't explain the wheelchair, he said quietly, then immediately regretted speaking as every eye in the room turned to him with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright hostility. Alina looked at him for a long moment, and Thompson had the uncomfortable feeling that she was measuring him in some fundamental way. Finally, she nodded slightly, as if he'd passed some kind of test by asking the direct question instead of dancing around it. The helicopter clipped a fuel truck during the landing, she said calmly. The truck exploded about 30 meters from the control tower. Shrapnel from the blast severed my spinal cord at the L2 vertebra. I've been in this chair for 2 years now. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Thompson felt like he was drowning in his own inadequacy, his earlier confidence replaced by a growing understanding of just how little he actually knew about anything that mattered. Here he'd been, bragging about his civilian flight hours to a woman who had literally sacrificed her ability to walk in order to save the lives of fellow service members. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and meant it. "I had no idea." Alina shrugged again, the gesture somehow conveying both acceptance and dismissal of his sympathy. "No reason you should have. Like I said, I was just doing my job." "Just doing your job?" Sarah repeated, and now her voice carried a weight of authority that made every cadet sit up straighter. Cadet Vasquez received the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism under fire. She saved 6 lives that day at the cost of her own mobility. And now she's here, starting over, learning to fly because she refuses to let her injury define the limits of her service to her country. Thompson felt something shift inside his chest, a realignment of his understanding that was both humbling and profound. He looked at Alina with new eyes, seeing not just the wheelchair but the steel in her spine, the quiet competence in the way she held herself, the matter-of-fact courage that had led her to risk everything for strangers. "Cadet Thompson," Sarah continued, her attention returning to him with laser focus, "you asked for challenging instruction. Cadet Vasquez holds commercial pilot ratings in both single and multi-engine aircraft, instrument ratings, and instructor certifications. She earned all of those while in physical rehabilitation, studying flight theory while learning to navigate the world from a wheelchair. She's here because she wants to become a pilot, not because flying came naturally to her, but because she's willing to work harder than anyone else in this room to earn it." Thompson nodded slowly, beginning to understand the true nature of the lesson he was being taught. "Ma'am, I understand. I'd be honored to train with Cadet Vasquez." Alina turned to look at him again, and this time there was something almost amused in her expression. "Oh, you'll be honored, all right," she said with a smile that was both friendly and slightly predatory. "I hope you're ready to work, Cadet Thompson, because I don't intend to make this easy for either of us." 3 weeks later, Thompson stood on the tarmac at 500 hours, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of amber and rose while he waited for Alina to arrive. The early morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the familiar sense of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid that had become as natural to him as breathing. His flight suit hung perfectly pressed on his frame, but beneath the regulation appearance, he was exhausted in ways he'd never experienced before. Alina had not been kidding about making things difficult. Over the past 21 days, she'd pushed him through flight theory sessions that lasted until midnight, practical exercises that tested every assumption he'd ever held about flying, and academic challenges that made his previous coursework look like elementary school homework. She approached every aspect of aviation with the kind of methodical precision that came from understanding that lives depended on getting things right the first time, every time. But it wasn't just the academic rigor that had transformed Thompson's understanding of what it meant to be a pilot. It was watching Alina navigate challenges that would have broken most people without ever once complaining or asking for special consideration. She designed custom controls for the flight simulators, working with the engineering department to create adaptive systems that allowed her to operate aircraft despite her paralysis. She'd memorized emergency procedures with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that could only come from someone who had seen firsthand what happened when systems failed. Most humbling of all, she demonstrated a kind of situational awareness that seemed almost supernatural. During simulator sessions, while Thompson was still processing the basic parameters of a given scenario, Alina was already 3 steps ahead, anticipating potential problems and developing contingency plans. She flew with her hands and her mind, compensating for her physical limitations through pure intellectual excellence and an understanding of aerodynamics that bordered on the artistic. The sound of wheels on asphalt drew Thompson's attention, and he turned to see Alina approaching in her wheelchair, moving with the efficient grace that characterized everything she did. She was carrying a thick folder of flight plans and reference materials, and Thompson noticed that she looked as fresh and alert as if she'd had 12 hours of sleep instead of the 4 he knew she'd actually gotten. "Morning, Thompson," she said as she rolled up beside him. "Ready for the real thing." Today marked their first actual flight together, not in the simulator, but in a genuine T-6 Texan II training aircraft. Thompson had been looking forward to this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, he felt a nervous tension in his stomach that had nothing to do with his usual pre-flight jitters. This wasn't about proving himself to an instructor anymore. This was about proving himself worthy of Alina's partnership and mentorship. Ready as I'll ever be, he replied, then caught himself. Over the past 3 weeks, Alina had gradually broken him of his habit of casual confidence, teaching him that true readiness came from preparation, not bravado. Actually, let me rephrase that. I've completed all the pre-flight study materials, reviewed the weather conditions and flight plan, and I'm prepared to execute today's training objectives to the best of my ability while remaining open to learning and correction. Alina smiled, and Thompson felt a familiar warm glow of satisfaction. Earning her approval had become more important to him than he cared to admit, not because he sought praise, but because he'd come to understand that her standards were calibrated against life-and-death realities rather than academic theory. Better, she said. Now help me get into the aircraft. We've got a lot to cover today. The process of getting Alina situated in the cockpit had been one of the first practical challenges they'd had to solve together. The T-6 wasn't designed with wheelchair accessibility in mind, but Alina had worked with the maintenance crew to develop a transfer system that preserved both her dignity and her safety. Thompson had initially felt awkward about the intimate nature of the assistance she required, but Alina's matter-of-fact approach had quickly normalized the process. Okay, she said once she was settled in the rear seat with her custom controls configured. Today we're going to work on formation flying. I know you've done some basic formation work in the simulators, but this is where theory meets reality. The margin for error drops to 0 when you're flying 3 feet off someone else's wingtip at 200 knots. Thompson nodded, running through his pre-flight checklist with the methodical attention to detail that Alina had drilled into him. Every switch, every gauge, every system had to be verified and double-checked. There were no shortcuts in aviation, no assumptions that could be made safely. Alina, he said as he worked through the engine startup sequence, can I ask you something personal? Shoot, she replied, her voice coming through the intercom with crisp clarity. Why are you doing this? I mean, you've already proven yourself in ways most people never will. You've got the Silver Star, you've served your country with honor, you could probably write your own ticket in civilian aviation or aerospace engineering. Why put yourself through all this again? There was a long pause before Alina answered, and Thompson could hear the sound of her flipping through the pages of her flight manual. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of consideration that told him she'd thought about this question many times before. You know about my accident, she said finally, but you don't know about what came after. The first year in rehabilitation was darker than I like to think about. I went from being someone who saved lives, who made split-second decisions that mattered, to someone who needed help reaching items on high shelves. The physical therapy was brutal, but the psychological adjustment was worse. Thompson listened in silence, sensing that this was a story Alina didn't share lightly. I was angry, she continued. Angry at the situation, angry at my body for failing me, angry at well-meaning people who told me I was inspiring for just getting through each day. I didn't want to be inspiring, I wanted to be useful, I wanted to matter again. The tower came through on the radio, clearing them for taxi, and Thompson acknowledged while Alina continued her story. About 18 months into recovery, I was at Walter Reed for a follow-up appointment, and I met this Marine. Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, no relation to our Lieutenant Martinez, by the way. He'd lost both legs to an IED in Iraq, and he was there getting fitted for new prosthetics. We got to talking, and he told me something that changed my perspective entirely. Thompson guided the aircraft toward the runway, following the taxi directions while hanging on Alina's every word. He said, Vasquez, you can spend the rest of your life mourning who you used to be, or you can spend it discovering who you're meant to become. But you can't do both. It sounds simple when I say it like that, but it hit me like a lightning bolt. I realized I'd been so focused on what I'd lost that I'd stopped thinking about what I might still be able to accomplish. They reached the runway threshold, and Thompson completed his final pre-flight checks while Alina's words settled into his consciousness like seeds in fertile soil. It's when I started researching adaptive aviation programs, Alina continued. I discovered that there were pilots flying commercial aircraft with various disabilities, military pilots who'd returned to service after amputations, people who'd found ways to make their limitations irrelevant through preparation, technology, and sheer determination. I realized that becoming a pilot wasn't just a career goal. It was a way to prove to myself that my accident hadn't defined the boundaries of my life. Tower cleared them for takeoff, and Thompson applied power while Alina monitored the engine parameters from the rear seat. The Texan II accelerated down the runway with smooth precision, and Thompson felt the familiar surge of exhilaration as the aircraft lifted off and climbed into the morning sky. "But there's more to it than that," Alina said once they'd reached their designated training altitude. "Every person I save, every mission I contribute to, every young pilot I help train, it's like paying back the debt I owe to the people who saved me. The medics who kept me alive after the explosion, the doctors who taught me to navigate the world from a wheelchair, the instructors who believed I could still contribute something meaningful to the service. I'm here because I refuse to let their investment in me be wasted." Thompson found himself blinking back unexpected moisture in his eyes as he processed the depth of Alina's commitment and sacrifice. Here was someone who had literally given pieces of herself in service to others, and rather than retreating into justified self-pity, she'd found a way to continue serving at an even higher level. "Contact 2 o'clock high," Alina's voice cut through his emotional reverie with professional precision. "Looks like our formation partners are here." Thompson looked up and spotted 2 other T-6 aircraft approaching from the northeast, their white and red paint schemes gleaming in the morning sunlight. His stomach tightened with anticipation and nervousness as he realized that the theoretical formation flying they'd practiced in the simulator was about to become very real indeed. "All right, Thompson," Alina said, her voice taking on the tone of command that he'd learned to respect and trust completely. "Time to put all that simulator practice to work. Remember, formation flying isn't about showing off or proving how skilled you are as an individual pilot. It's about becoming part of a team, about synchronizing your aircraft with others to accomplish objectives that none of you could achieve alone." The lead aircraft came up on the radio, call sign Falcon Lead, with instructions for the training exercise. They would be practicing close formation flying, tactical approaches, and coordinated maneuvers that simulated combat scenarios. Thompson acknowledged the instructions while Alina continued her coaching from the rear seat. "The key to successful formation flying," she explained as Thompson maneuvered into position behind and to the right of the lead aircraft, "is anticipation. You can't just react to what the lead aircraft is doing. You have to anticipate what they're going to do next based on the mission profile, their aircraft's performance characteristics, and the tactical situation. It's like a dance where you have to know the steps before the music starts." Thompson eased the Texan II into formation position, watching the lead aircraft's wingtip with intense concentration. The margin for error was exactly as Alina had described, vanishingly small. At this distance, any sudden movement or lapse in attention could result in a mid-air collision that would kill everyone involved. "Smooth inputs," Alina coached. "Don't fight the controls. Let the aircraft flow into position like water finding its level. Formation flying is about finesse, not force." For the next hour, they practiced increasingly complex maneuvers. Thompson's initial nervousness gradually gave way to intense focus as he discovered the unique demands of flying in close proximity to other aircraft. It required a kind of spatial awareness that went beyond normal piloting skills, a constant calculation of relative positions, speeds, and intentions that taxed every aspect of his training. "Thompson," Alina said during a brief rest period between exercises, "I want you to understand something. What we're doing out here isn't just about learning to fly in formation. It's about learning to trust your teammates with your life and earning their trust in return. In combat, you might have to fly through enemy fire to protect your wingman or trust them to cover you while you make a dangerous approach. That kind of trust isn't built through grand gestures. It's built through exactly this kind of precision and reliability in small things." As if summoned by her words, Falcon Lead's voice crackled through the radio with a new challenge. "Falcon Flight, we're going to simulate a damaged aircraft scenario. Falcon 3, you are now flying with simulated hydraulic failure and reduced control authority. Falcon 2 and 4 will provide escort and assistance for emergency landing procedures." Thompson felt his heart rate spike as he realized they were now facing exactly the kind of scenario Alina had been preparing him for. This wasn't a simple formation flying exercise anymore. This was a simulation of the life-and-death situations that combat pilots faced regularly. "Falcon 3 copies," Alina responded smoothly, taking control of the radio while Thompson focused on flying. "Requesting escort to alternate field for emergency landing." What followed was 30 minutes of the most challenging flying Thompson had ever experienced. The simulated emergency required precise coordination between all 4 aircraft, with Thompson and Alina providing close escort, while the damaged aircraft made an approach to a training airfield under simulated combat conditions. Every decision had to be made quickly and correctly, with no room for hesitation or error. "Watch their approach angle," Alina coached as they accompanied Falcon 3 toward the runway. "They're coming in steep and fast, which is correct for a combat approach, but it means we have to adjust our escort pattern to stay clear of their flight path while still providing protection." Thompson found himself operating at a level of concentration he'd never achieved before. His awareness expanded to encompass not just his own aircraft, but the entire tactical situation. He could feel Alina's presence in the rear seat like a steadying influence, her experience and knowledge flowing through their shared intercom connection to guide his decisions. The exercise culminated in a successful landing for all 4 aircraft, but as Thompson taxied back toward the parking area, he realized that something fundamental had changed in his understanding of what it meant to be a pilot. This wasn't about individual skill or natural talent. It was about becoming part of something larger than himself, about accepting responsibility for others' lives and trusting them with his own. "How do you feel?" Alina asked as they completed their post-flight procedures. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, trying to find words for the transformation he'd experienced. "Humbled," he said finally, "and grateful. 3 weeks ago, I thought being a good pilot was about being better than other people. Now I understand it's about being worthy of their trust." Alina nodded with satisfaction. "Now you're starting to understand. But Thompson, there's something else I need to tell you, something about why Lieutenant Martinez paired us together." Thompson turned in his seat to look at her, sensing that another revelation was coming. "It wasn't random," Alina continued. "Martinez served in Afghanistan, 2 different unit but same time frame. She knew about my accident, knew about my recovery, and she specifically requested me for this instructor program. She saw something in you that reminded her of herself when she was starting out, natural talent, but dangerously overconfident. She paired us together because she thought I could teach you what she wished someone had taught her when she was young and cocky, and certain she was invincible." Thompson felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. What happened to her? What made her change? Alina's expression grew solemn. "That story about Captain Morrison, the pilot who died because he thought he was too good for standard procedures. That wasn't just a cautionary tale, Thompson. Jake Morrison was her wingman. She was leading the formation when he decided to show off, when he took risks that got himself and 2 other crews killed. She's carried that responsibility for years, wondering if she could have done something different, said something that would have kept him grounded in reality instead of lost in his own ego." The weight of this revelation settled over Thompson like a physical presence. Lieutenant Martinez hadn't been lecturing him about arrogance in the abstract. She'd been trying to save him from making the same mistakes that had cost her friend his life. "She sees potential in you," Alina continued, "but she also sees danger. Natural talent without wisdom, confidence without humility. That's why she wanted you to work with me, not to break your spirit, but to channel your abilities in ways that serve something larger than your own ego." Thompson sat in silence, absorbing the implications of what Alina had shared. The entire structure of his training, from that first confrontation in the briefing room to this morning's formation flying exercise, had been carefully orchestrated to teach him lessons that couldn't be conveyed through textbooks or lectures. "Thank you," he said finally, "for telling me and for everything else. I know this hasn't been easy for you either." Alina smiled, but there was something different in her expression now, a weight that Thompson was only beginning to understand. "Thompson, there's one more thing. Something I haven't told you about why I really came back to flying." She paused, her hands resting on her wheelchair's controls, and Thompson could see that whatever she was about to share was difficult for her. "The helicopter crew that I saved that day, the ones who were wounded and coming in under fire. One of them was a medic named Sarah Martinez." The words hit Thompson like a physical blow, and he felt the world suddenly shift around him as the final pieces of an intricate puzzle clicked into place. His mouth went dry as he processed the implications of what Alina had just revealed. That Lieutenant Martinez, their stern and demanding instructor, owed her life to the woman sitting behind him in the cockpit. She was on that helicopter?" Thompson managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Alina nodded, her green eyes distant as she recalled memories that were clearly both precious and painful. She was a flight surgeon then, attached to a forward medical unit. They'd been providing emergency care at a remote outpost that had come under heavy fire, and they were evacuating wounded when their helicopter took multiple hits from small arms fire. The pilot had taken shrapnel to the chest. The co-pilot was unconscious, and they were losing altitude fast when they reached our perimeter. Thompson sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the image of Lieutenant Martinez as a wounded medical officer with the composed and authoritative instructor he'd come to know. The morning sun streamed through the cockpit canopy, casting everything in golden light that seemed surreal given the weight of Alina's revelation. I remember her voice over the emergency frequency, Alina continued, her words coming slowly as if she were pulling them from deep memory. Even though she was injured, even though their aircraft was falling apart around them, she was still trying to coordinate medical care for the other wounded on board. She was giving instructions to a junior medic, talking him through procedures to stabilize a soldier who was bleeding out, all while their helicopter was basically crashing. The implications were staggering. Lieutenant Martinez hadn't just been a witness to Alina's heroism, she had been one of its direct beneficiaries. The formation of their training partnership, the careful orchestration of lessons and challenges, the personal investment that both women had shown in Thompson's development, it all took on new meaning in light of this connection. "Does she know?" Thompson asked. "I mean, does Martinez know that you were the controller who saved them?" Alina's smile was sad and complicated. "She knows. We figured it out during my first week here. She was reviewing my service record for the instructor program, and when she saw the citation details for my Silver Star, she put the pieces together. The date, the location, the circumstances, it all matched her memories of that day." Thompson felt a strange mixture of awe and humility wash over him as he began to understand the depth of the relationship between his instructor and his training partner. These weren't just two military professionals working together. They were bound by a shared experience of life and death, sacrifice and survival, that created connections deeper than normal military protocol could account for. "What was it like," he asked quietly, "when you both realized?" Alina was quiet for a long moment, her hands absently adjusting her position in the aircraft seat. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of emotion that Thompson had rarely heard from her. "It was overwhelming," she said finally. "For both of us, I think. I'd carried the image of that helicopter crew in my mind for 2 years, wondering what had happened to them, whether they'd all made it home safely. And suddenly, here was one of them not just alive but thriving, serving as an instructor at the most prestigious military academy in the world." She paused, and Thompson could hear her taking a deep breath through the intercom. "But for Sarah, Lieutenant Martinez, I think it was even more complicated. She'd spent years carrying survivor's guilt about that day, wondering why she'd made it home when other good people hadn't. And then she discovers that the person who saved her life is now a paraplegic, that my heroic action had cost me the use of my legs. She felt responsible, I think, as if my sacrifice was somehow her fault." Thompson felt his chest tighten with emotion as he imagined the psychological weight both women had been carrying. Alina, dealing with the physical and emotional trauma of her injury while maintaining her determination to continue serving. Martinez, living with the knowledge that others had paid a price for her survival while struggling with her own losses and regrets. "Is that why she's been so hard on me?" Thompson asked, the question emerging from a growing understanding of the complex dynamics at play. "Because she sees something in me that reminds her of the pilots she lost." "Partly," Alina agreed, "but it's more than that. Sarah Martinez is one of the most gifted natural pilots I've ever encountered. She could have been a test pilot, an aerobatics champion, anything she wanted in aviation. But she chose to become an instructor because she believes that passing on hard-earned wisdom is more important than personal glory. She sees young pilots like you, talented, confident, full of potential, and she remembers what it was like to think that natural ability was enough." The radio crackled with instructions from the tower, and Thompson mechanically acknowledged while processing Alina's words. Around them, the routine operations of a military airfield continued, aircraft taking off and landing, ground crews servicing planes, instructors and students engaged in the timeless process of passing knowledge from one generation to the next. "But here's what I think you need to understand," Alina continued, her voice taking on the tone of gentle instruction that Thompson had learned to pay careful attention to. "Neither Sarah nor I are interested in your gratitude or your sympathy. We're not sharing these stories with you to make you feel guilty or to burden you with our experiences. We're telling you these things because they illustrate truths about military service that can't be taught through textbooks or simulator exercises." Thompson nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he understood what Alina was getting at. "The truth is that every time you climb into a cockpit, every time you take responsibility for an aircraft and potentially for other people's lives, you become part of a chain of service and sacrifice that stretches back generations. The techniques you're learning, the procedures you're memorizing, the judgment you're developing, all of it has been paid for with blood and dedication by people who came before you." She paused, and Thompson could sense that she was choosing her words carefully. Sarah lost her wingman because he forgot that truth. He started thinking of flying as something he did for himself, a way to prove his individual superiority, instead of understanding that he was part of something larger and more important than his personal ambitions. Jake Morrison was a good pilot and a good man, but his ego cost lives that didn't need to be lost. Thompson felt a chill run down his spine as he fully grasped the parallel Alina was drawing. 3 weeks ago, he had been on the same path as Morrison, talented, overconfident, and dangerously disconnected from the reality of what military aviation actually demanded. "But you're different," Alina continued. "Or at least, you're becoming different. The work we've done together, the way you've responded to instruction and feedback, the humility you've shown when confronted with your own limitations. All of that tells me that you have the potential to become the kind of pilot who brings people home safely instead of getting them killed." The weight of Alina's words settled over Thompson like a mantle of responsibility. He was beginning to understand that his training wasn't just about becoming qualified to fly military aircraft. It was about becoming worthy of the trust that would be placed in him by fellow service members, by the families who sent their sons and daughters into harm's way, by the nation that depended on military professionals to execute missions that civilian society couldn't even imagine. "Alina," he said quietly, "can I ask you something else?" "Of course." "When you made that decision to coordinate the triple landing that saved the helicopter crew, did you know it might cost you your ability to walk?" Alina was quiet for a long moment, and Thompson wondered if he'd crossed a line by asking such a personal question. But when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. "I knew it was dangerous," she said finally. "The helicopter was badly damaged, coming in too fast, and there were multiple variables that could have gone wrong. But in that moment, the calculation was simple. 6 people were going to die if I didn't act, and there was at least a chance that everyone would survive if I did. The risk to myself wasn't part of the equation." Thompson absorbed this, trying to imagine the kind of split-second decision-making that Alina was describing. To instantly weigh complex variables, calculate probabilities, and choose a course of action that prioritized others' lives over personal safety. It represented a level of moral courage and professional competence that he was only beginning to comprehend. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Never," Alina replied without hesitation. "Not for a single second. The only thing I regret is that it took me so long to figure out how to continue serving after my injury. I wasted almost 2 years feeling sorry for myself when I could have been working toward this, toward becoming a pilot and instructor who could help prepare the next generation of military aviators." Before Thompson could respond, his attention was drawn to movement on the tarmac below. A figure in a flight suit was walking toward their aircraft with the purposeful stride he recognized as belonging to Lieutenant Martinez. Even from a distance, there was something different about her posture, something that suggested she was carrying news of unusual importance. "Looks like Martinez is coming to debrief us," Alina observed. "This should be interesting." Thompson watched as their instructor approached, noting the way she moved with the controlled precision that characterized everything about her professional demeanor. But as she drew closer, he could see something in her expression that he'd never observed before, a combination of pride, concern, and what looked almost like anticipation. Martinez reached the aircraft and waited while Thompson completed his shutdown procedures, and Alina prepared to transfer back to her wheelchair. The process had become routine over the weeks they'd been training together, but Thompson noticed that Martinez watched the proceedings with careful attention, as if seeing something in their partnership that pleased her. "How did it go up there?" Martinez asked once Alina was situated, and they'd moved to a quiet area away from the flight line operations. "Better than expected," Alina replied, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that Thompson had learned to treasure. Thompson handled the formation work well, showed good judgment during the simulated emergency, and demonstrated the kind of situational awareness that suggests he's finally starting to understand what this is really about. Martinez nodded, but Thompson could see that she had something specific on her mind. Her usual post-flight debriefing style was thorough and methodical, covering every aspect of the training mission in detail. Today, however, she seemed focused on something beyond the technical aspects of their flight. "Thompson," she said, turning her attention to him with an intensity that made him straighten unconsciously. "I've been reviewing your progress over the past 3 weeks, and I have to say that the change has been remarkable. When you first walked into my classroom, you reminded me of someone I used to know, someone who thought natural talent was a substitute for wisdom and humility." Thompson felt his cheeks burn with the memory of that first morning, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact with Martinez as she continued. "But the pilot who flew that formation exercise today is someone completely different. Someone who understands that flying isn't about proving individual superiority, but about becoming part of a team that's capable of accomplishing missions that no individual could handle alone." She paused, and Thompson sensed that she was choosing her words with unusual care. "Which brings me to why I'm here. I've received word from headquarters that there's been a change in your training schedule. You've been selected for an advanced program that will accelerate your progression toward operational status." Thompson felt his heart skip a beat. Advanced programs were reserved for the most promising candidates, representing opportunities that could shape entire military careers. "However," Martinez continued, "the program requires you to leave the academy immediately. You'd be transferred to a specialized training facility where you'd work with a different set of instructors and training partners." The excitement that had initially surged through Thompson was suddenly tempered by an unexpected sense of loss. The prospect of advancement was thrilling, but the thought of leaving Alina and Martinez behind, of breaking the bonds that had been forged through weeks of intensive training and shared challenges, was more painful than he'd anticipated. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "may I ask what kind of program this is?" Martinez exchanged a glance with Alina that carried layers of meaning Thompson couldn't fully interpret. When she turned back to him, her expression was serious, but somehow softer than usual. "It's a test pilot program, Thompson. They're looking for candidates who combine natural flying ability with the kind of judgment and humility that comes from understanding the real stakes of military aviation. The selection committee reviewed your training records, including Alina's evaluations of your progress, and decided that you represent exactly the kind of pilot they're trying to develop." Thompson felt the world spinning around him as he processed the magnitude of what Martinez was offering. Test pilot programs were the pinnacle of military aviation careers, reserved for individuals who would push the boundaries of aeronautical science while maintaining the highest standards of safety and professionalism. But even as the professional implications sank in, Thompson found himself thinking about Alina's journey, how she'd fought to overcome her disability and earn her place in the pilot training program, how she dedicated herself to helping him understand truths about service and sacrifice that couldn't be taught through conventional instruction. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I'm honored by the opportunity, but I have to ask, what happens to Alina? I mean, does this affect her training program at all?" Martinez smiled, and Thompson realized it was the first genuine, unguarded smile he'd ever seen from her. "Cadet Vasquez has also been selected for a specialized program," she said. "Not test pilot training. Her path is different. She's been chosen for an instructor development program that will prepare her to train the next generation of adaptive aviation specialists. The Air Force is expanding its programs for disabled pilots and aircrew, and they need someone with Alina's combination of technical expertise, practical experience, and teaching ability to lead that effort." Thompson felt a surge of joy and pride on Alina's behalf, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that their paths were diverging, just as they developed the kind of partnership he'd never experienced before. "There's one more thing," Martinez continued, and now her voice carried a note of something that sounded almost like mischief. "Both programs are being conducted at the same facility. You'll be training at Edwards Air Force Base, and while your specific courses will be different, you'll be working in the same environment with many of the same instructors." Thompson felt relief flood through him, followed immediately by curiosity about Martinez's role in these developments. "Ma'am, can I ask how these opportunities came about? I mean the timing seems convenient, Martinez finished. That's because I recommended both of you for these programs. Alina's qualifications were obvious, her technical knowledge, her experience with adaptive systems, her natural teaching ability. But your recommendation was more complicated. She paused, her gaze moving between Thompson and Alina with an expression that conveyed both pride and something deeper. A sense of completion, perhaps, or resolution. 3 weeks ago, you were a talented but dangerous pilot in training who reminded me painfully of mistakes I'd made and friends I'd lost. But watching you work with Alina, seeing how you've responded to real challenges and genuine mentorship, has convinced me that you have the potential to become exactly the kind of aviator the service needs. Thompson felt emotion tightening his throat as he began to understand the full scope of what Martinez and Alina had accomplished. They hadn't just trained him to be a better pilot. They'd fundamentally changed his understanding of what it meant to serve others, to be part of something larger and more important than individual ambition. But here's the thing, Martinez continued, her voice taking on the tone of gentle authority that Thompson had learned to respect completely. None of this, not the advanced training, not the career opportunities, not the chance to work with cutting-edge technology. None of it matters if you forget the lessons you've learned here. The moment you start thinking that your achievements are about your individual superiority rather than your ability to serve others, you become dangerous to yourself and everyone around you. Thompson nodded solemnly, understanding that Martinez was offering him both an extraordinary opportunity and a solemn responsibility. I understand, ma'am, and I want you both to know that whatever happens next, whatever I accomplish in my career, it will be built on the foundation that you've given me here. Alina taught me what real courage looks like, and you taught me what real leadership requires. I won't forget those lessons. Alina reached over and grasped Thompson's hand with surprising strength. Remember, Thompson, this isn't the end of our partnership. It's just the beginning of the next phase. We'll both be at Edwards, working on different aspects of the same mission. The Air Force is changing, becoming more inclusive and more effective, and we get to be part of that transformation. Martinez nodded approvingly. Alina's right. What you've accomplished together here isn't just about your individual development. It's about proving that the military can adapt, that we can find ways to utilize every person's talents regardless of their physical limitations, and that true excellence comes from collaboration rather than competition. As Thompson looked at the two remarkable women who had transformed his understanding of military service, he felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with determination. The arrogant young man who had challenged his instructor's authority just 3 weeks ago seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who understood that real strength came from acknowledging limitations and working to overcome them through dedication and teamwork. "When do we leave for Edwards?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning," Martinez replied. 600 departure. I'll be flying you both out there personally. It turns out I'm being assigned to the base as well to help develop new instructor training protocols based on what we've learned from your partnership. Thompson felt a final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The three of them, instructor, student, and mentor, weren't being separated after all. They were being moved together to a new environment where they could continue the work they'd started, helping to shape the future of military aviation in ways that honored both tradition and innovation. As they walked together toward the administrative buildings to complete their departure paperwork, Thompson realized that his call sign, Razor, no longer seemed appropriate. The sharp edges of his arrogance had been worn away through weeks of challenging training and honest self-examination. He needed a new call sign, something that reflected what he'd learned about service, sacrifice, and the bonds that held military professionals together. "Alina," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about my call sign. Razor doesn't feel right anymore." Alina smiled knowingly. "What did you have in mind?" Thompson considered for a moment, thinking about all the lessons he'd learned and the relationships that had transformed him. "Phoenix," he said finally, "like the mythical bird that rises from its own ashes, because the pilot I used to be had to die before I could become who I needed to be." Alina and Martinez exchanged approving glances, and Thompson realized that he'd chosen well. "Phoenix it is," Martinez said. "It suits you. And Thompson, welcome to the real Air Force, the one where we lift each other up instead of tearing each other down." As they continued toward the building, Thompson, now Phoenix, felt a profound sense of completion mixed with anticipation. The journey that had begun with his arrogant challenge to Lieutenant Martinez had led him to discoveries about courage, sacrifice, and service that would guide him for the rest of his career. And the partnerships he'd forged with Alina and Martinez would continue to evolve and deepen as they faced new challenges together at Edwards. Behind them, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the training grounds where other cadets were just beginning their own journeys of discovery and transformation. The cycle would continue, young pilots arriving with natural talent and dangerous confidence, experienced instructors working to channel that potential towards service rather than self-aggrandizement, and the timeless process of forging individual excellence into collective strength. But for Thompson, for Phoenix, this chapter of his training was complete. He had learned what it meant to earn his wings not through individual achievement, but through becoming worthy of the trust and partnership of people like Alina Vasquez and Sarah Martinez. And that understanding would carry him forward into whatever challenges lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that true flight was never a solo journey.